Making a Roblox game sounds easy until you open Studio and realize you have absolutely no idea what half these buttons do. Recently I came across DeHappy's YouTube channel, specifically a cookie clicker video he made a long time ago. It was a short video where he showed the process of making a game from scratch. Not everything worked perfectly the first time, but he kept figuring things out until he eventually made it work. And I don't know, there was just something really inspiring about that. It was short, simple, and it felt honest. So if you have not seen it, you should definitely give it a watch. But yeah, that is exactly what inspired this series. And what is the series? Well, here's the plan. I'm going to use Codex as my own personal teacher. The idea is simple. First, it explains a complex topic or a piece of code that I do not fully understand yet. Then, it gives me an example of how it works, and more importantly, why it works. After that, it gives me a small task to build something similar on my own. And once I finish, Codex can use MCP to look directly inside my Roblox project, find the code, and check if I actually got it right. So instead of just watching tutorials and hoping everything clicks, this series is about learning by building, getting feedback, making mistakes, and slowly becoming better with every game. To start, we first connect the MCP inside of the studio. We do that by clicking the Assistant button in the top right corner of the studio and activating the MCP server for Codex. Then we paste in a pretty big prompt that tells Codex to act like a Roblox development teacher. Whenever it teaches a new topic, it first checks the Roblox documentation and developer forums to make sure everything is up to date. And from there, it follows the same learning loop every single time. Explain the concept, show a real example, give me a task to complete on my own, then review my work and tell me what I got right and what I can improve. After that, I ask him to confirm that MCP is working. And don't worry, I will leave the prompts in the description if you want to give it a try. Now that we have established the persona, we are ready to start with the first lecture. Project Setup in Modern Luau Foundations. This is where we set up the project properly from the beginning and make sure we are not learning outdated habits before we even start building. So the first thing we covered was why Roblox games should not be built as one giant script. In Roblox, module scripts are loaded with require. They return one value and they only run once inside each Luau environment. That means if the server requires a module, it gets its own version, and if the client requires that same module, the client also gets its own separate version. So right away, we have to understand the boundary between server code, client code, and shared code. A single giant script might feel easier at the beginning. Everything is in one place. You can scroll through it, change things quickly, and it feels like you are moving fast. But once the game grows, that same script becomes a problem. Player data, UI, remotes, inventory, NPCs, upgrades, and game logic all start depending on each other. And then changing one thing can randomly break something completely different. That is where modules start to make sense. Instead of having everything mixed together, each module gets one clear responsibility. The server should handle trusted game logic, player data, and anything important that the client should not control. The client should handle UI, effects, animations, and visuals. And shared modules should only contain safe things that both sides can use, like constants, types, configs, and utility functions. So for example, putting shared code in replicated storage makes sense when both the server and client need access to it. But anything sensitive should stay on the server, inside places like server script service or server storage, because anything in replicated storage can be seen by the client. Another important part is using !! strict. Strict typing helps turn your modules into clear contracts. If a function says it returns a number, Luau can help catch mistakes before the game even runs. And that is the main senior mindset here. Modules define boundaries, types define contracts, and together they make the project easier to scale, debug, optimize, and secure. What even is this task? At this point, I realized something. It did explain the topic technically, but not in a way that actually helped me complete the assignment. So now I had two options. I could keep learning like this, where Codex gives me a vague explanation, then a task that forces me to search for the missing pieces somewhere else, and honestly, that is not the worst thing in the world. That is kind of how real programming works sometimes. But since the whole point of this series is to use Codex as a teacher, I decided it made more sense to ask it to slow down, explain things better, and break the lesson into smaller chunks. So I told them, "You haven't taught me the scripting basics yet. I want to learn from zero. So please show me a simple example, then give me a similar task that is different enough for me to apply the concept myself." And as you can see in the background, that's exactly what he did. Lecture was simple and easy to understand, and the task was different enough to where I had to think about it, but close enough to apply what he taught me earlier. Here you can see me asking for the review. Codex then looks through my Roblox project, finds the code, and reviews what I wrote. And with that, the first task is done. There are still a few small changes to apply, but overall, the process worked. And for the final check, we did it. That is the first task completed. Now I am going to continue through a few more lectures so I can finish the first step of the curriculum that Codex created. And after that, I will make a quick summary of everything I learned today. At some point, I asked Codex for a roadmap of what was coming next. The next lectures cover safer stat systems, cleaner module boundaries, client versus server logic, remote events, remote functions, UI controllers, state management, tools, character lifecycle, cleanup, collection service, attributes, collision groups, data saving, round systems, server authority, and finally, production polish. So basically, the plan is to go from simple scripting foundations all the way to building Roblox systems in a cleaner, safer, and more scalable way. So, what did I actually learn by the end of this session? Which, by the way, lasted around 4 hours of me just going back and forth with Codex. Well, here are the last 4 scripts I wrote. First one, Combat Stats Bootstrap. This script is basically the starting point for the Combat Stats system. Strict turns on stricter Luau type checking, so mistakes are easier to catch early. Then it gets the player service and requires the Combat Stats service module, which holds the actual stat setup logic. After that, it loops through any players who are already in the game and calls setup player for each one. And finally, it listens for new players joining, so every new player also gets their combat stats set up. So the important thing here is that this script does not do the heavy logic itself. It just starts the system and tells the service when to run. Second one, Combat Stats Config. This script is the configuration file for the combat stats. First, I define a type called Combat Stat Config, which says every stat needs a name and a starting value. After that, I create the actual list of stats. Kills starts at 0, deaths starts at 0, and streak starts at 0. Finally, the script returns the config table, so other scripts can require it and use the same stat list. So instead of hard-coding these stats in multiple places, everything is defined once, in one clean module. Third one, Combat Stats. This one is basically a small test script for the Combat Stats service. First, it gets the player service and requires Combat Stats service. Then it creates a function called Test Combat Stats Service, which runs for one player. Inside that function, it waits 2 seconds, then adds 1 kill and 1 streak to the player. After that, it reads the current kills and streak values from the service and prints them into the output. At the bottom, it runs the test for players who are already in the game and also connects it to player added, so it runs when a new player joins. So this script helped me confirm that the service was actually adding, reading, and updating stats correctly. The last one is Combat Stats Service. This is the core of everything I have shown so far, and since it is a bit bigger, I split it into 3 parts. So here is the first part. First, it loads the Combat Stats config, because this service needs to know which stats should exist. Then it creates the Combat Stats Service table and starts defining the Setup Player function. This function checks if the player already has a leader stats folder. If the folder does not exist, it creates one. But if something named leader stats already exists and it is not actually a folder, the script gives a warning and stops, because that would mean something is wrong. After that, it goes through every stat in the config. For each one, it checks if the stat already exists. If it does not, it creates a new int value, gives it the correct name, sets the starting value, and puts it inside leader stats. And if the stat already exists, but it is not an int value, it warns me about that too. So this part is basically responsible for safely creating the player's combat stats without duplicating folders or breaking existing values. The second part is the add stat function. This function is responsible for increasing one of the player's combat stats. First, it looks for the player's leader stats folder. If the folder is missing, or if something named leader stats exists but is not actually a folder, it warns me and stops. Then it looks for the specific stat I want to update, like kills or streak. If that stat does not exist, it warns me again and stops. And if the stat exists, but it is not an int value, it also stops, because the script should only change proper number values. Finally, if everything is valid, it adds the amount to the stat's current value. So this function does not blindly change data. It checks everything first and only updates the stat when it is safe to do so. This function is called getStatValue. Instead of changing a stat, it is used to read the current value of a stat. Just like before, it first checks if the player has a valid leader stats folder. Then it looks for the specific stat I asked for. If anything is missing, or if the stat is not an int value, it warns me and returns nil. That is why the function returns number ? It means the result can either be a number or nothing if something went wrong. But if everything is valid, it returns the stat's current value. And at the very end, the module returns combat stats service, so other scripts can require it and use these functions. So this service now handles the full flow. It can set up the stats, add to them, and read their current values. And that is it for this video. Over the next few days, I'm going to try to complete the full course that Codex made for me, and then I will give you an update on how it went. After that, we can finally move on to actually making games. I know this video format is not the most engaging thing in the world, and it is not exactly packed with action, but I mainly started this channel to keep myself accountable and to keep myself working towards something. So thank you very much for watching. If you want to follow my journey as I learn Roblox development, be sure to subscribe. And if you enjoyed the video, leaving a like would really help. Also, if you somehow made it all the way to the end, write banana bread in the comments. But yeah, that is it for this one. See you in the next video.